At 15 below zero, the Montana dawn looked like a postcard, but Sarah Mitchell knew better. That glittering beauty? It meant death was coming fast, and in the crosshairs of the blizzard was Bison, not just any bull, but Thunder her. Late husband's pride, the ranch's lifeline, and the only gentle giant in a bloodline of monsters. But today, nature wasn't playing fair. The ropes froze, the trailer wouldn't start. And Thunder? He wouldn't move. Not until something unthinkable happened, something no one on that ranch had ever seen. The girl fresh out of vet school? She walked right up to him barehanded in a storm and whispered. What followed didn't just save a $200,000 bull. It exposed a truth about Bison no cowboy had ever dared believe. And by sundown, it wouldn't be Thunder they feared. It'd be losing him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana dawn broke with that deceptive beauty that only comes before nature shows her teeth. Sarah Mitchell stood at her kitchen window, steam from her coffee mug fogging the glass as she watched the thermometer outside register -15 degrees. Ice crystals had transformed the ranch into a glittering wonderland overnight, coating every fence post and building in a treacherous shell that would make the morning's work dangerous. Hell of a morning for moving Thunder, Jake Thompson muttered as he stomped into the kitchen, his weathered face already red from the cold despite the early hour. The head ranch hand had been working the Mitchell place for 30 years, and Sarah had learned to trust his instincts about weather and animals above all else. Can't be helped, Sarah replied, though her stomach twisted with worry. The weatherman's calling for that blizzard to hit by noon. If we don't get Thunder moved to the winter barn now, we'll be stuck with him in the exposed paddock for the next 3 days. Thunder, even his name carried weight on the ranch. The 5-year-old Angus bull was worth more than most people's houses. $200,000 of pure muscle, breeding potential, and championship bloodlines. Sarah's late husband Charlie had spotted Thunder as a calf at an auction in Texas, seeing something in the young bull that others had missed. 3 years later, Thunder had become the most successful rodeo bull in the circuit, his offspring commanding premium prices, his stud fees keeping the ranch afloat during the lean years. But success had made Thunder confident, perhaps too confident. Unlike other bulls who grew meaner with age, Thunder had remained remarkably gentle, almost docile. He'd never challenged a human, never shown aggression toward the ranch hands who worked around him daily. Children on school tours would pet his massive head while Thunder stood patient as a saint. It was this very gentleness that made him so valuable, a champion bull with the temperament of a family pet. Maria's already down at the paddock, getting the lead rope ready, Jake continued, pouring himself coffee from the pot that never seemed to empty in the Mitchell kitchen. Girls got away with him, I'll give her that. Maria Santos was the ranch's newest hire, fresh out of veterinary school and full of ideas about animal psychology that made Jake roll his eyes. But even the grizzled cowboy had to admit the young woman had an almost supernatural ability to read animal emotions. Thunder responded to her like she spoke his language. Sarah pulled on her heaviest coat, the one Charlie had bought her 3 winters before the cancer took him. The ranch had been struggling even then, but he'd insisted she needed proper protection against the Montana cold. A ranch is only as strong as its weakest link, he'd say, and I won't have my wife freezing to death while checking on our stock. The cold hit like a physical blow as they stepped outside. The ice storm had left everything glazed in a sheet so smooth, it looked like the world had been dipped in glass. Sarah's boots crunched through the surface with each step, leaving dark holes in the pristine coating. Thunder stood in the paddock like a monument carved from black stone, his breath creating clouds in the frigid air. At 1,800 pounds, he dominated the landscape, his massive frame radiating the quiet confidence that had made him legendary. His dark eyes tracked their approach with the intelligence that set him apart from ordinary bulls. Easy, big guy, Maria called softly, her voice carrying that special tone she reserved for nervous animals. Though Thunder showed no signs of nervousness, he rarely did. The bull lowered his huge head as she approached, allowing her to scratch behind his ears in the spot that always made him rumble with contentment. "Let's make this quick," Jake said, his breath forming clouds as he spoke. "Ice this thick, somebody's going to take a spill." The plan was simple. Maria would lead Thunder across the courtyard using the path Jake had salted earlier, while Sarah opened the gates and Jake followed behind to ensure the bull didn't change his mind halfway across. It was a routine they'd performed dozens of times, though never in conditions quite this treacherous. Thunder followed Maria willingly, his massive hooves finding purchase on the salted sections of the path. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to relax. They were going to make it without incident. Then the ice betrayed them all. Thunder's rear hoof hit a patch where the salt hadn't penetrated deeply enough. The massive bull, thrown off balance by his own momentum, scrambled desperately for footing on the slick surface. His front legs went out from under him first. Then his entire body was sliding sideways toward the old barn. The crash sounded like the world ending. 1,800 pounds of muscle and bone smashed through the barn wall with the force of a freight train. The wooden planks, weathered by decades of Montana winters, splintered like matchsticks. The corrugated metal roofing, torn from its moorings, came down in jagged sheets that sliced through the air with deadly precision. Thunder! Maria's scream cut through the chaos as the dust and debris settled. The bull lay trapped in the collapsed section of the barn, his left flank torn open by razor-sharp metal. Blood, shocking red against the white snow, spread in an expanding pool beneath him. But it was the sound Thunder made that turned Sarah's blood to ice, a bellow of pure agony and confusion that seemed to echo from the very depths of his soul. As Thunder struggled to rise, his eyes changed. The gentle intelligence Sarah had grown to love was replaced by something primal and terrible. Pain had awakened every instinct that centuries of domestication had suppressed. The friendly giant who had tolerated children's hands was gone, replaced by nearly a ton of wounded, frightened predator. "Get back!" Jake shouted as Thunder lunged toward Maria, his massive head lowered in a charge that would have crushed her. Instantly, the young woman scrambled backward, falling hard on the ice as the bull's horns whistled through the air. Where she'd been standing, Sarah felt her world tilting as she watched Thunder retreat into the wreckage of the barn, blood streaming from multiple wounds, his eyes wild with an agony that had transformed him into something she no longer recognized. The ranch's most valuable asset, her husband's legacy, the foundation of their financial survival, all of it was trapped behind a wall of pain and fear that might prove impossible to breach. Thunder bellowed again, the sound carrying across the ranch like a warning. Stay away, trust no one, let no one near. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Sarah heard the echo of Charlie's voice. Every animal teaches us something. Sarah, sometimes the lesson is harder than we want to learn. The lesson beginning to unfold in the blood-stained snow might cost them everything. Within an hour of Thunder's accident, the sky had darkened to the color of old pewter, and the first snowflakes began falling with ominous purpose. What started as gentle flakes quickly transformed into a driving wall of white that reduced visibility to mere yards. The weatherman's prediction of a historic blizzard was proving conservative. Sarah's hands shook as she dialed Dr. Elena Rodriguez's number for the third time, praying for better news than the previous calls had delivered. The veterinarian's voice crackled through the poor connection, barely audible above the howling wind that had risen to a sustained 50-mile-per-hour roar. "Sarah, I'm trying to get to you, but the roads are closing faster than the plows can." "Clear them," Dr. Rodriguez shouted over the static. "I'm stuck behind a jackknife semi on Highway 89. They're saying it could be hours before they can move it. And even then..." The line went dead. Sarah stared at the silent phone, Then at the emergency radio, Jake had tuned to the weather service. The announcer's voice carried grim authority. Interstate 15 is now closed from Great Falls to the Canadian border. All secondary roads in Glacier County are impassable. Residents are advised to shelter in place until further notice. The power flickered, died, then surged back to life with the rumble of the emergency generator kicking in. The sudden darkness, even momentary, seemed to mock their efforts to maintain control over a situation that was spiraling beyond anyone's ability to manage. "Transformers iced over," Jake announced grimly, stamping snow off his boots as he entered the kitchen. His face bore the red marks of frostbite's first warning. "Generators got maybe 12 hours of fuel, assuming the storm doesn't knock out the exhaust vent." Through the kitchen window, they could see the damaged barn where Thunder remained trapped. The emergency lights Jake had rigged cast eerie shadows through the falling snow, creating a scene that looked more like a disaster movie than the peaceful ranch Sarah had awakened to that morning. "We have to try again," Maria said, her voice tight with determination and barely controlled panic. She'd been pacing the kitchen like a caged animal, unable to sit still while Thunder suffered. "He's losing blood. Every minute we wait, he gets weaker." Jake shook his head, his weathered features grim. "Girl, I've been handling livestock since before you were born. That bull's not the same animal we knew this morning. Pain changes everything. In a creature that size, he'll kill anyone who gets within 10 feet of him." "Then we use the tranquilizer equipment," Maria insisted. "Tom Bradley's got dart guns at his ranch. If we can get there, Tom's place is 15 miles through country that's completely snowed in." Sarah interrupted gently. "And even if we could reach him, Jake's right. Thunder's too agitated. Miss with a dart gun, and we'll have a drug. Wounded, angry bull. That's worse than what we're dealing with now." Maria's face crumpled, tears of frustration freezing on her cheeks. "So we just let him suffer? Let him die?" The question hung in the air like the ice crystals forming on the windows. Outside, they could hear Thunder's occasional bellows, weaker now but still carrying that note of wild agony that cut through the storm's howling. Jake had already made 2 attempts to approach the damaged barn, using every trick 30 years of experience had taught him. The first time, he'd tried approaching from the blind side, moving slowly with a rope and hoping to get close enough to assess Thunder's injuries properly. The bull had charged with such violent force that the remaining barn structure had shuddered, sending more debris crashing down around them both. The second attempt had involved the tractor, using its blade as a shield while Jake tried to maneuver close enough to create some kind of barrier between Thunder and his wounds. But the bull's fury had only intensified at the mechanical noise, and his charges had become even more dangerous. Jake had been forced to retreat when Thunder's horns punctured the tractor's hydraulic line, sending fluid spraying across the snow in dark arcs. "What about approaching from above?" Maria suggested desperately. "The hayloft access. Structural damage is too severe," Jake cut her off. "Whole section could come down if we put weight on those beams. And Thunder's got his eye on every angle now. He's not just hurt, he's terrified. Cornered. That makes him 10 times more dangerous than any healthy bull." Sarah poured herself another cup of coffee, though her hands were shaking too badly to trust herself with the hot liquid. The numbers running through her head were stark and unforgiving. Thunder represented more than just his purchase price or even his stud value. He was the cornerstone of their breeding program, the genetic foundation upon which the ranch's future depended. Losing him would mean losing everything Charlie had built, but there was something else eating at her, something beyond the financial disaster looming over them. Thunder's transformation from gentle giant to wounded monster felt like a betrayal of everything she'd believed about the animals in her care. How could something so familiar become so alien in the space of a heartbeat? In the barn across the courtyard, barely visible through the driving snow, another drama was unfolding that None of the humans had noticed. Sunset, the 28-year-old cutting horse who had been scheduled for euthanasia the following Monday, stood alert in her stall despite the arthritis that usually left her stiff and painful on cold nights. The old mare's ears were pricked forward, swiveling constantly toward the damaged section where Thunder's bellows emerged. Her usually clouded eyes held an intensity that would have surprised anyone who had written her off as a burden on the ranch's resources. Every time Thunder cried out, Sunset's muscles tensed as if she were preparing to move, though her arthritic joints protested any sudden motion. Something in Thunder's voice spoke to her in a language older than human understanding. Pain calling to pain, fear recognizing fear. Sunset had spent decades reading the emotional states of horses, bulls, and humans alike. In Thunder's anguished bellows, she heard not just physical agony, but the deeper terror of an animal who had never known vulnerability and didn't understand how to process it. The storm continued to intensify, and the humans continued their desperate planning, unaware that the solution to their crisis might lie not in their experience or equipment, but in the wisdom of an old horse they'd already decided had outlived her usefulness. Thunder's next bellow carried a note of weakness that made Maria sob openly. Time was running out, and every conventional approach had failed. But wisdom, as Charlie used to say, often comes from the most unexpected sources. By midnight, the storm had transformed the ranch into an Arctic wasteland, and Sarah found herself alone in her office, surrounded by the brutal mathematics of survival. The ledger book spread across Charlie's old oak desk told a story she'd been trying to ignore for months. Each page revealed another month of operating at a loss, another veterinary bill that cut deeper into their dwindling reserves, another payment deferred in the hope that next month would somehow be different. Thunder's labored breathing echoed faintly through the walls, each sound a reminder that time was bleeding away as surely as the bull himself. The storm had knocked out the phone lines an hour ago, leaving them completely cut off from the outside world. Even if Dr. Rodriguez could somehow reach them, the question remained whether Thunder would survive long enough for professional help to matter. Sarah pulled out the ranch's insurance papers, her hands trembling as she located the livestock policy. Thunder was insured for his full market value, $200,000, that could keep the ranch operating for another 2 years if managed carefully. But only if his death could be classified as accidental rather than the result of negligent care. If the insurance company determined that Thunder had died due to inadequate emergency response, she pushed the thought away. But the numbers wouldn't be ignored. The ranch was hemorrhaging money faster than she could find sources of income. Feed costs had doubled in the past year due to drought conditions. Veterinary expenses seemed to climb monthly as their aging livestock required more intensive care. And then there were the animals like Sunset, the old cutting horse's euthanasia. Appointment was scheduled for Monday morning 3 days away, assuming Dr. Rodriguez could make it through the storm. The decision had been purely economic. Sunset's arthritis medication cost $800 monthly. Her special feed added another $300, and her heating bills during Montana winters pushed her maintenance costs above what many families spent on groceries. Charlie's voice seemed to whisper from the shadows of the office. Every animal teaches us something, Sarah. The trick is being wise enough to learn the lesson. But what lesson was there in keeping a horse who could barely walk while potentially losing the bull who represented their entire future? Sunset had been a champion once, the best cutting horse in 3 states, with trophy buckles and ribbons to prove it, but that was 15 years ago. Now she was a 28-year-old mare whose greatest accomplishment was helping nervous children overcome their fear of horses during summer riding lessons. Sarah opened the file marked Sunset Medical Records and winced at the accumulating costs. Joint supplements, pain medications, specialized shoeing, regular chiropractic adjustments. Expenses mounted relentlessly. The veterinary notes were equally sobering. severe arthritis in both front fetlocks and left shoulder. Recommend considering quality of life issues if condition continues to deteriorate. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thunder's bellow pierced the night again. Weaker now, but still carrying that note of wild panic that had transformed him from gentle giant to something unrecognizable. Sarah closed the file and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass as she watched the emergency lights struggle against the driving. Charlie had loved that old horse with an intensity that had sometimes puzzled Sarah. "She's got teacher's wisdom," he would say whenever Sarah questioned the expense of keeping Sunset comfortable. "Watch her with the young ones, horses and humans alike. She knows things we've forgotten how to see." But teacher's wisdom didn't pay veterinary bills or keep the lights on. Sarah had learned to make hard decisions during the 18 months since Charlie's death. Choices that would have horrified the idealistic young woman who'd fallen in love with both the man and his vision of a ranch where every animal mattered. The reality was stark and unforgiving. If Thunder died, the insurance money might keep them afloat long enough to rebuild their breeding program around younger bulls. But that assumed they could afford to maintain the ranch infrastructure and care for animals who contributed nothing to their income. Animals like Sunset, whose only value now lay in the memories of what she'd once been. Maria's words from earlier in the evening echoed in Sarah's mind. So we just let him suffer? Let him die? The young woman's idealism reminded Sarah painfully of herself 20 years ago, when she'd believed that love and determination could overcome any obstacle. Thunder's breathing seemed more labored now, each exhalation visible in the frigid air as a cloud that dispersed quickly in the wind. Sarah found herself calculating how long the bull could survive with his injuries, how long before blood loss and shock would make the decision for them. In the barn, barely 50 yards away but unreachable through the storm, Sunset stood alert. In her stall, despite the cold that usually left her joints locked with pain, the old Mari's attention remained fixed on the damaged section where Thunder lay trapped, her ears constantly tracking the sounds of his distress. Something in her ancient wisdom recognized what the humans could not yet see. That sometimes the answer to an impossible situation comes not from strength or youth, but from understanding born of experience with pain, loss, and the courage to act despite one's own limitations. But Sarah, lost in the brutal calculations of survival, had no way of knowing that salvation might be standing arthritic and forgotten in a stall she'd planned to empty forever in just 3 days. Maria couldn't sleep. The howling wind seemed to carry Thunder's cries directly through her bedroom walls, each pained bellow a reminder of her helplessness. At 2 in the morning, she abandoned any pretense of rest and pulled on her heaviest coat, deciding to check on the other animals. If she couldn't help Thunder, at least she could ensure the rest of the livestock weren't suffering unnecessarily in the brutal cold. The barn felt like stepping into a frozen cathedral, the emergency lighting casting long shadows between the key stalls. Most of the horses stood quietly, conserving energy against the cold. But as Maria approached the far end of the building, she noticed something unusual. Sunset wasn't lying down as she typically did during the night hours when her arthritis was most painful. Instead, the old Mare stood alert at the front of her stall, her head turned toward the damaged section where Thunder remained trapped. "Hey, old girl," Maria whispered, producing a carrot from her pocket. "Can't sleep either?" Sunset's usual evening routine was predictable, painful movements, difficulty settling, often requiring Maria's help to find a comfortable position. But tonight, despite the cold that should have made her joints scream with protest, the Mare moved toward Maria with something approaching her old fluid grace. As Maria gently brushed Sunset's winter coat, memories flooded back with startling clarity. She'd been 12 years old when Charlie Mitchell had first brought her to meet this horse. A terrified city kid whose parents thought riding lessons might help her overcome crippling shyness. Sarah had wanted to start her on one of the younger, smaller horses, but Charlie had insisted on Sunset. "This old gal's got teacher's wisdom," he'd said in that gentle drawl that made even the most nervous animals calm down. "She knows how to read what you need before you know it yourself." Maria remembered her first ride on Sunset's back, the way the mare had seemed to sense her fear and adjusted her gait accordingly, never moving faster than Maria felt comfortable with, somehow communicating patience and understanding through the connection between horse and rider. Week after week, Sunset had carried scared children on her back, transforming their fear into confidence with an intuitive understanding that veteran riding instructors envied. The mare had been magnificent in her prime, a cutting horse whose ability to read cattle movements bordered on supernatural. Maria had watched old videos of Sunset in competition. The way she'd anticipate a steer's direction changes before the animal itself seemed to know where it was going. Charlie used to say Sunset could read minds, both animal and human. "You were something special, weren't you?" Maria murmured, running her hand along Sunset's neck. The mare's attention remained fixed on the far end of the barn, her ears swiveling toward every sound from Thunder's direction. Another memory surfaced. Spring afternoon 3 years ago, when a young bull had gotten tangled in wire fencing. The animal had worked itself into such a panic that Jake and the other ranch hands couldn't get near it. Sarah had been ready to call Dr. Rodriguez when Charlie had suggested something unconventional. "Bring Sunset out to the fence line," he'd said. "Let her see what's happening." Maria had thought the idea was Charlie's illness talking. The cancer had been affecting his judgment by then. But they'd led Sunset to where the young bull thrashed against the wire, and something remarkable had happened. The old mare had positioned herself where the bull could see her, then had simply stood still, radiating a calm presence that seemed to flow across the distance between them. Within minutes, the bull had stopped thrashing. He'd focused on Sunset with an intensity that was almost hypnotic, his breathing gradually synchronizing with hers. When Jake had approached again, moving slowly and deliberately as Sunset demonstrated through her own stillness, the bull had allowed the ranch hands to free him from the wire without further struggle. "Animals understand each other in ways we've forgotten," Charlie had explained later. "Sunset's been hurt, been afraid, then helpless. She remembers what that feels like. And somehow that memory becomes wisdom." Now, as Thunder's weakening cries echoed through the storm, Maria noticed something that made her heart race. Every time the bull bellowed, Sunset's muscles tensed as if she were preparing to move. Her usually clouded eyes held an intensity Maria hadn't seen in years, and despite the arthritis that typically left her stiff and careful in her movements, the mare seemed almost eager to act. "You want to help him, don't you?" Maria whispered, and Sunset's ears flicked toward her voice before returning to their focused attention on Thunder's location. That it was impossible. Of course, Sunset was scheduled for euthanasia in 3 days precisely, because her physical limitations had made her a burden rather than an asset. But as Maria watched the old mare's alert posture and saw the intelligence burning in her eyes, she began to wonder if they'd all been making a terrible mistake. Charlie's voice seemed to echo. "In the barn's shadows, she knows things we've forgotten. How to see? What if the solution to Thunder's crisis wasn't something they needed to bring from outside, but something that had been standing in their barn all along?" Dawn arrived without fanfare, the storm having transformed day into an indistinguishable extension of the nightmare that had begun 18 hours earlier. The emergency radio crackled with reports that made Sarah's heart sink further with each update. Interstate 15 remained closed, secondary roads were impassable, and rescue crews were stranded across 3 counties. They were truly on their own. Rodriguez's voice finally broke through the static at 6:30, weak and distorted, but carrying devastating news. "Sarah, I tried everything. My truck's buried in a drift 2 miles from the Peterson Place. I'm hiking out, but even with snowshoes, it'll take me hours to reach you. How's Thunder holding up? Sarah looked toward the damaged barn, where Thunder's bellows had grown noticeably weaker throughout the night. Not good, Elena. He's losing a lot of blood, and we can't get near him. Listen carefully. Dr. Rodriguez's voice faded in and out. If you can create any kind of barrier between him and his wounds, even temporary, it might buy us time. But Sarah, if he goes into shock. The transmission dissolved into static, leaving the sentence unfinished but its meaning crystal clear. Jake had spent the pre-dawn hours preparing what he grimly called the last resort attempt. Every piece of equipment on the ranch that might serve as protection was now arranged near the damaged barn. Sheets of plywood, the front loader from the tractor, even the old cattle chute they'd dragged from storage. One more try, he announced to Sarah and Maria as they gathered in the kitchen at 7. His face bore the marks of exhaustion and desperation. If this doesn't work, we're going to have to face facts about what Thunder's suffering means. The plan was elaborate in its desperation. Jake would approach from the east using the front loader as a shield, while Maria created a distraction from the west side with the air horn from Jake's pickup. Sarah would monitor from the house, ready to call off the attempt if it became too dangerous. They moved into position as the pale morning light struggled through the driving snow. Thunder's outline was barely visible through the debris, a dark mass that occasionally shifted and bellowed with the kind of pain that seemed to echo in their bones. Jake started the tractor, its diesel engine coughing to life in the brutal cold. The machine lurched forward through the snow, the front loader raised like a knight's shield. For a moment, it seemed like the approach might work. Thunder lifted his massive head but remained still, perhaps too weak to mount his usual violent response. Then everything went wrong. The tractor hit a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow, causing it to slide sideways toward the damaged barn structure. Jake fought for control, but the machine's momentum carried it directly into Thunder's line of sight. The bull's response was immediate and terrifying, a charge so violent that the remaining barn supports shuddered under the impact. Thunder's horns caught the front loader's hydraulic line, puncturing it with surgical precision. Fluid sprayed across the snow in dark arcs as Jake scrambled to reverse the tractor away from the enraged animal. But Thunder wasn't finished. The bull's next charge brought down a section of roofing that crashed inches from where Jake sat, metal sheeting sharp enough to slice through steel. "Get out of there!" Sarah screamed from the house, but her voice was lost in the chaos of Thunder's bellowing and the tractor's struggling engine. Jake managed to retreat, but not before Thunder's final charge had brought down more debris, effectively sealing off any approach from the east side. The bull had created his own fortress of twisted metal and splintered wood, making him even more inaccessible than before. In the barn, Sansa had begun pacing in her stall with increasing agitation. Each of Thunder's cries seemed to trigger a physical response in the old Mar, her arthritic joints moving with a fluidity that defied her age and condition. She pressed against her stall door, testing the latch with her nose, her entire body. Language screaming urgency. But the humans, focused on their failing technological solutions, remained oblivious to the growing desperation of the one creature who might actually understand what Thunder needed. Jake's attempt had made everything worse. Thunder was now more aggressive, more isolated, and significantly weaker from the additional stress and blood loss. As Jake stumbled back to the house, his face pale with the recognition of failure, Sarah found herself facing the decision she'd been dreading since the accident began. "We might have to consider ending his suffering," she said quietly, the words feeling like betrayal even as she spoke them. Maria's face crumpled. "There has to be another way. We haven't tried everything." But as Thunder's bellows grew weaker and the storm showed no signs of abating, it seemed that all conventional options had been exhausted. Time was running out. And every human effort had only made the situation more desperate. None of them noticed Sunset's increasingly frantic behavior, or the way the old Mare's attention remained fixed on Thunder's location with an intensity that suggested she knew something they didn't. The conversation Sarah had been dreading began at 8:30 in the morning, 18 hours after Thunder's accident. She sat at the kitchen table with Jake, the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on both, like the storm that continued to rage outside. The emergency radio had gone silent an hour ago, the last transmission confirming what they already knew: no help was coming. "We can't let him suffer like this," Jake said quietly, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long since gone cold. "I've seen too many animals die hard deaths to pretend there's mercy in letting this drag on." Sarah nodded numbly, though every instinct rebelled against the thought. Thunder represented more than money. He was Charlie's legacy, the foundation of everything they'd built together. But she'd also heard the increasing weakness in the bull's cries, seen the expanding pool of blood visible even through the snow and debris. "Dr. Rodriguez's emergency kit is in the barn office," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's enough to make it peaceful." That's when Maria burst through the kitchen door like a force of nature, her eyes wild with excitement and urgency. Snow covered her coat and ice crystals clung to her hair, evidence of her sprint from the barn through the blizzard. "You have to come see this," she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. "Sunset, she's done something I've never seen before." Jake's expression shifted to weary irritation. "Maria, we don't have time for..." "She's opened her stall door," Maria interrupted, her words tumbling over each other in their urgency. Somehow she worked the latch open, and now she's standing in the barn aisle, staring directly at the damaged section where Thunder is trapped. "She won't move, won't let me lead her back to her stall. She's just waiting." Sarah felt a flicker of something that might have been hope, though logic told her it was probably just desperation. "Horses can open simple latches, Maria. It doesn't mean..." "This isn't simple," Maria cut her off, her voice gaining strength. "You know how stiff Sunset gets on cold mornings. You know how she can barely move when her arthritis flares up. But right now, she's standing there like she's 20 years younger, like she's got purpose driving her." Jake shook his head dismissively. "Girl, you're seeing what you want to see. That old horse is probably just confused by all the commotion. Animals sense distress. It doesn't mean she can do anything about it." But Maria's eyes blazed with conviction. 3 years ago, Charlie used Sunset to calm that young bull when he got tangled in the wire fence. Remember? You all thought he was crazy, but it worked. Sunset has some kind of ability to communicate with distressed animals. "That was different," Jake protested. "That bull wasn't injured, wasn't aggressive like Thunder is now. And Sunset was in better shape then. Was she?" Maria challenged. "Her arthritis was already bad 3 years ago. But Charlie saw something in her that the rest of us missed. What if we're missing it again?" Sarah found herself caught between hope and practicality. The idea seemed absurd. Arthritic old horse who was scheduled for euthanasia in 3 days suddenly becoming their salvation. But Charlie's voice seemed to whisper from memory. "Every animal teaches us something, Sarah. Sometimes the lesson comes from the most unexpected teacher." "Even if Sunset could somehow help," Sarah said carefully, "we can't risk her safety. Thunder's already proven he'll charge anything that moves. If he hurts Sunset, what if she's already made that choice?" Maria's voice was quiet now, but it carried an intensity that made both adults look at her sharply. "What if she understands the situation better than we do? What if she knows something we don't about what Thunder needs?" Jake started to speak, but Maria held up her hand. "I want to show you something. Both of you need to see how she's behaving before we make any final decisions about Thunder." They bundled into their coats and followed Maria through the storm, fighting against wind that seemed determined to push them back to the house. The barn felt like a sanctuary after the brutal cold outside. But what they saw there stopped all three of them in their tracks. Sunset stood in the center aisle like a statue carved from living flesh. Her entire attention focused on the damaged section where Thunder lay trapped. Her usual arthritic stiffness was completely absent, replaced by an alertness and purpose that transformed her entire bearing. When Thunder's weakened bellow echoed through the barn, Sunset's ears flicked forward and her muscles tensed as if she were preparing to respond. "Jesus," Jake breathed, his skepticism wavering for the first time. "I've never seen her stand like that." As they watched, Sunset took a single deliberate step toward Thunder's location, then stopped as if waiting for permission or perhaps for the humans to understand what she was offering. "She wants to try," Maria whispered. "Look at her body language. She's asking us to let her help." Sarah stared at the old mare, seeing not the burden she'd planned to eliminate, but an animal radiating purpose and determination despite her physical limitations. The question that would change everything hung in the air. Would they trust the wisdom of a horse they'd already written off as worthless? For a long moment, the only sounds in the barn were the storm's howling and Thunder's increasingly labored breathing. Sarah stared at Sunset, seeing the old mare through new eyes, not as the financial burden she'd planned to eliminate, but as an animal radiating purpose and intelligence that defied her physical limitations. "This is insane," Jake muttered, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "We're talking about sending an arthritic horse toward a bull that's already proven he'll attack anything that moves." "Everything we've tried has been insane," Maria shot back. "Tractors, ropes, distraction techniques, nothing conventional has worked. Maybe it's time to try something unconventional." Sarah's mind raced through the calculations that had become second nature. Sunset was worth perhaps a few $100s at auction, if anyone would even bid on a horse her age with her medical issues. Thunder represented $200,000 in breeding potential and insurance value. From a purely economic standpoint, risking the horse to save the bull made perfect sense. But this wasn't about economics anymore. Something in Sunset's bearing suggested this was bigger than human calculations could encompass. "If we let her try," Sarah said slowly, "and Thunder charges her, then we lose a horse we were planning to put down anyway," Jake finished grimly. "But Sarah, if that bull kills Sunset right in front of us, if we have to watch her die because we let desperation cloud our judgment." Maria stepped closer to Sunset, and the mare immediately turned her attention to the young woman, their eyes meeting in a moment of communication that seemed to transcend species. "She knows the risks," Maria said quietly. "Look at her. This isn't confusion or random behavior. She's making a choice." Thunder's bellow echoed through the barn again, noticeably weaker than before. Time was running out for all of them. In another hour, maybe two, shock and blood loss would make the decision for them. Sarah closed her eyes and heard Charlie's voice as clearly as if he were standing beside her. Sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from the most unexpected teachers. The trick is being humble enough to learn. When she opened her eyes, her decision was made. "We let her try," she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "But we stay close. At the first sign that Thunder's going to charge, we pull her back." Jake's face went pale. "Sarah, this goes against everything I've learned in 30 years of handling livestock. That bull is beyond reason right now. Maybe that's exactly why we need someone who speaks a different language than reason," Sarah replied. They moved as a group toward the damaged section of the barn, Sunset walking between them with a fluid grace that seemed impossible given her age and condition. Her arthritis, which typically left her stiff and careful in cold weather, appeared to have simply vanished. Each step was deliberate and purposeful, her attention fixed unwaveringly on Thunder's location. As they approached the debris field, Thunder's massive head lifted. His eyes, clouded with pain and wild with fear, fixed on the approaching group. Sarah's heart stopped as she saw the bull's muscles tense, his entire body coiling for what she was certain would be a devastating charge. But then something extraordinary happened. Thunder's gaze moved past the humans and locked onto Sunset. The old Mare had positioned herself slightly ahead of Sarah, Maria, and Jake, her body language calm but alert. For the first time since his accident, Thunder didn't immediately lower his head in an aggressive posture. Instead, he remained still, studying this new presence with an intensity that was almost hypnotic. Sunset took another step forward, then stopped just outside the range of Thunder's horns. The distance was carefully calculated, close enough for communication, far enough to avoid immediate danger. She lowered her head in what looked like a gesture of submission, but Sarah realized it was something more complex. It was acknowledgement, recognition, the kind of greeting one wounded soul might offer another. Thunder's ears flicked forward, the first non-aggressive response he'd shown since the accident. His breathing, which had been rapid and panicked, began to slow as he focused entirely on the old Mare. The barn fell into a silence so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. "Jesus," Jake whispered. "Look at his body language. He's not preparing to charge." Sunset remained perfectly still, radiating a calm presence that seemed to flow across the space between them. Her eyes never left Thunder's, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the massive bull's aggressive posture began to relax. The crossing between two worlds, human desperation and animal wisdom, had begun. And for the first time in 18 hours, Sarah dared to hope that both Thunder and Sunset might survive to see another dawn. What followed defied everything Sarah thought she understood about animal behavior. Sunset and Thunder began what could only be described as a conversation, not in sounds or obvious gestures, but in a language composed of breathing, positioning, and an energy exchange that seemed to flow between them like an invisible current. Sunset took one more careful step forward, bringing herself to the very edge of what would normally be considered safe distance from an aggressive bull. Thunder's eyes tracked her movement, but instead of the violent response they'd all expected, his massive head tilted slightly, as if he were listening to something only he could hear. Then Sunset did something that made Maria gasp audibly. Despite her arthritis, despite the cold concrete floor that should have sent shockwaves of pain through her joints, the old Mare slowly lowered herself to the ground. It wasn't the careful, painful descent Sarah had witnessed hundreds of times during Sunset's evening routines. This was deliberate, graceful, a conscious choice to make herself vulnerable in front of a creature who could kill her with a single movement. "She's showing him her own pain," Maria whispered, her voice filled with awe. "Look at how she's positioned herself. She's not hiding her limitations, she's sharing them." Thunder's response was immediate and profound. His ears, which had been pinned back in aggression for hours, moved forward in a gesture of attention and impossibly what looked like recognition. The massive bull, who had charged at every human approach with deadly intent, remained perfectly still as he studied the old Mare, who had chosen to make herself defenseless before him. Sunset began to make soft sounds, not typical horse vocalizations, but something deeper and more primal. The sounds came from her chest, low and rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat made audible. They carried no threat, no demand, only a gentle acknowledgement of presence and understanding. Thunder's breathing, which had been shallow and panicked since his accident, began to synchronize with the rhythm of Sunset's vocalizations. Sarah watched in amazement as the bull's respiratory rate slowed, his chest rising and falling in time with the old Mare's gentle sounds. It was as if Sunset was teaching him how to breathe calmly again, how to exist in the present moment rather than the panic that had consumed him. "I've never seen anything like this," Jake murmured, his skepticism completely dissolved. "It's like she's talking to him." But it was more than talking. As the minutes passed, Sarah began to understand that she was witnessing something far more profound than communication. Sunset wasn't trying to fix Thunder or solve his problems. She was simply being present with his pain, acknowledging it without trying to make it go away. The old Mare shifted her weight carefully, and Sarah noticed something remarkable. Sunset was positioning herself so that her own arthritic joints were clearly visible to Thunder, the stiffness in her shoulders, the careful way she held her front legs, the subtle signs of chronic pain that had made her a candidate for euthanasia. She was showing Thunder that she too understood what it meant to hurt, to be vulnerable, to face limitations that couldn't be overcome through strength or will. Thunder's massive head lowered until it was level with Sunset's, though he maintained the careful distance she had established. His eyes, which had been clouded with panic and aggression, began to clear. For the first time since his accident, Sarah could see glimpses of the gentle intelligence that had made Thunder so special. The bull's tail, which had been switching violently with agitation, stilled. His muscles, tensed for fight or flight since the moment of his injury, began to relax incrementally. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Thunder was beginning to trust not just Sunset, but the moment itself. Dr. Rodriguez had told them that psychological trauma could be as debilitating as physical injury in animals, that fear and pain could create a cycle that made healing impossible. But what Sarah was witnessing suggested that healing might come not from eliminating pain, but from sharing it with someone who understood. Sunset's breathing deepened, and Thunder's followed suit. The old Mare's eyes never left the bull's, maintaining a connection that seemed to anchor him in the present rather than the terror of his accident. When Thunder's next breath came out as something closer to a sigh than a pant, Sarah felt tears freezing on her cheeks. She's not trying to save him, Sarah realized aloud. She's teaching him that it's okay to be hurt, that being wounded doesn't mean being alone. The insight hit her like a physical blow. For 18 hours, they'd all been focused on fixing Thunder, on solving the problem of his injury and aggression. But Sunset understood something they'd missed, that Thunder's greatest fear wasn't the pain itself, but the isolation that came with it. The bull, who had never experienced vulnerability before his accident, didn't know how to exist as anything other than strong and invincible. Sunset was showing him that vulnerability could coexist with dignity, that needing help didn't diminish worth. The old Mare, who had been written off as useless, was demonstrating that wisdom and compassion could be more powerful than youth and strength. Thunder's next vocalization was different, not the bellow of rage and fear that had echoed through the ranch for hours, but something softer, almost questioning. Sunset responded with one of her gentle chest sounds, and Thunder's entire posture shifted. The aggressive stance that had kept everyone at bay began to dissolve, replaced by something that looked remarkably like acceptance. "He's ready," Maria whispered. "Look at his body language. He's ready to trust." Sarah realized with growing amazement that Sunset had accomplished in 20 minutes what all their equipment, expertise, and desperation had failed to achieve in 18 hours. The old Mare had created a space where healing could begin, not through force or medical intervention, but through this simple act of shared understanding. Thunder was learning that he didn't have to face his pain alone, and in doing so, he was opening the door for the help that might save his life. The sound of boots crunching through snow outside the barn made everyone freeze. Dr. Elena Rodriguez appeared in the doorway like a snow-covered apparition, her emergency veterinary bag clutched in one hand and ice crystals coating her face mask. She'd abandoned her stranded truck 3 miles away and hiked through the blizzard, following fence lines and sheer determination to reach the ranch. "I got here as fast as I could," she gasped, pulling off her mask and taking in the scene before her. Her words died as she saw Sunset lying calmly near Thunder, the massive bull no longer displaying any signs of aggression. How is this possible?" "Sunset," Sarah said simply, her voice filled with wonder that hadn't diminished in the 30 minutes since the old Mare had begun her intervention. "She's been with him for half an hour. He hasn't charged once since she approached." Dr. Rodriguez moved slowly into the barn, her trained eye assessing Thunder's condition while marveling at the unprecedented scene. The bull's breathing was steady, his posture relaxed despite his obvious injuries. Most remarkably, his attention remained focused on Sunset rather than the new human presence that would have triggered violent responses just hours earlier. In 15 years of veterinary medicine, I've never seen anything like this, Dr. Rodriguez murmured, carefully approaching the damaged section. Injured bulls, especially ones in this much pain, don't just calm down. The trauma response is too strong, the fear too overwhelming. Thunder's head turned toward the veterinarian, but instead of the aggressive posturing they'd all learned to expect, he looked to Sunset as if seeking reassurance. The old Mare made one of her gentle chest sounds, and Thunder's ears flicked forward, in what could only be described as acceptance. He's asking her permission, Maria breathed. Look at their body language. He's checking with Sunset before deciding how to respond to Dr. Rodriguez. Sarah watched in amazement as the veterinarian began her approach, moving with the same careful deliberation that Sunset had demonstrated. Dr. Rodriguez seemed to understand instinctively that she was entering a sacred space, that the connection between horse and bull was facilitating something far beyond normal medical intervention. Talk to him, Dr. Rodriguez instructed quietly. Keep that communication going while I examine his injuries. Sunset continued her gentle vocalizations as the veterinarian knelt beside Thunder, her hands moving with practiced efficiency over his wounds. The bull's massive frame tensed slightly at the human touch, but each time his anxiety began to rise, Sunset would shift position slightly or make one of her calming sounds, and Thunder would settle again. These lacerations are severe, Dr. Rodriguez reported as she cleaned the wounds with antiseptic. The largest one is about 8 inches long and goes deep into the muscle tissue. There's also significant trauma to the left shoulder joint, though I don't think anything's broken. Thunder flinched as the antiseptic stung, a rumble of discomfort escaping his chest. Sunset immediately responded, lowering her head until her muzzle was just inches from Thunder's face. She breathed gently in his direction, and the bull's tension visibly decreased. Incredible, Dr. Rodriguez muttered as she began suturing the worst of the cuts. His pain response is completely manageable. Normally, an injury this extensive would require heavy sedation, but his stress levels are so low that he's tolerating the procedure beautifully. Sarah found herself crying as she watched the old Mare continue her patient vigil. Sunset never moved from her position, never broke the visual connection she'd established with Thunder. Despite the arthritis that should have made lying on the cold concrete agonizing, despite her own discomfort and fatigue, the horse maintained her calming presence throughout the entire medical procedure. How is she doing this? Jake whispered, his voice filled with awe. It's like she's taking on his pain somehow, absorbing it so he doesn't have to carry it alone. Dr. Rodriguez worked steadily, cleaning and suturing wounds, administering antibiotics and pain medication, checking for internal injuries that might have been missed in the initial assessment. Through it all, Thunder remained cooperative in a way that defied every veterinary textbook she'd ever studied. The psychological component of animal trauma is something we're just beginning to understand, Dr. Rodriguez explained as she worked. But what I'm seeing here suggests that emotional support can be as important as medical intervention. Sunset isn't just keeping Thunder calm, she's actively participating in his healing process. As the veterinarian finished her work, applying bandages and protective coverings to the worst wounds, Thunder began to show signs of the sedative she'd administered. His massive head grew heavy, his breathing deepened, and slowly his eyes began to close. But even as consciousness faded, his gaze remained fixed on Sunset until the very last moment. He's going to be fine, Dr. Rodriguez announced, sitting back on her heels with visible relief. The wounds will heal cleanly, and there's no sign of internal bleeding or organ damage. With proper care and rest, he should make a complete recovery. Sarah felt her knees nearly buckle with relief, but her attention remained fixed on Sunset. The old mare had finally begun to show signs of her age and condition. Moving carefully, she shifted position to ease the pressure on her arthritic joints, but she didn't move away from Thunder. Even unconscious, the bull seemed to draw comfort from her presence. "What about Sunset?" Sarah asked, her voice catching. "How long can she maintain this?" Dr. Rodriguez studied the old mare with new respect. "As long as she chooses to, I suspect. Animals have a wisdom about these things that we often underestimate. She knows when Thunder no longer needs her." Maria knelt beside Sunset, gently stroking the mare's neck. "You saved him," she whispered. "You saved them both." But as Sarah watched the old horse's patient vigil continue, she realized the salvation had flowed in both directions. Thunder's life had been preserved, but Sunset had rediscovered her purpose, proving that worth couldn't be measured in economics or physical capability, but in the depth of wisdom and compassion that comes from a lifetime of service and understanding. The sound of boots crunching through snow outside the barn made everyone freeze. Dr. Elena Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. Like a snow-covered apparition, her emergency veterinary bag clutched in one hand and ice crystals coating her face mask. She'd abandoned her stranded truck 3 miles away and hiked through the blizzard, following fence lines and sheer determination to reach the ranch. "I got here as fast as I could," she gasped, pulling off her mask and taking in the scene before her. Her words died as she saw Sunset lying calmly near Thunder, the massive bull no longer displaying any signs of aggression. How is this possible?" "Sunset," Sarah said simply, her voice filled with wonder that hadn't diminished in the 30 minutes since the old mare had begun her intervention. "She's been with him for half an hour. He hasn't charged once since she approached." Dr. Rodriguez moved slowly into the barn, her trained eye assessing Thunder's condition while marveling at the unprecedented scene. The bull's breathing was steady, his posture relaxed despite his obvious injuries. Most remarkably, his attention remained focused on Sunset rather than the new human presence that would have triggered violent responses just hours earlier. "In 15 years of veterinary medicine, I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Rodriguez murmured, carefully approaching the damaged section. "Injured bulls, especially ones in this much pain, don't just calm down. The trauma response is too strong, the fear too overwhelming." Thunder's head turned toward the veterinarian, but instead of the aggressive posturing they'd all learned to expect, he looked to Sunset as if seeking reassurance. The old mare made one of her gentle chest sounds, and Thunder's ears flicked forward, in what could only be described as acceptance. "He's asking her permission," Maria breathed. "Look at their body language." "He's checking with Sunset before deciding how to respond to Dr. Rodriguez." Sarah watched in amazement as the veterinarian began her approach, moving with the same careful deliberation that Sunset had demonstrated. Dr. Rodriguez seemed to understand instinctively that she was entering a sacred space, that the connection between horse and bull was facilitating something far beyond normal medical intervention. "Talk to him," Dr. Rodriguez instructed quietly. "Keep that communication going while I examine his injuries." Sunset continued her gentle vocalizations as the veterinarian knelt beside Thunder, her hands moving with practiced efficiency over his wounds. The bull's massive frame tensed slightly at the human touch, but each time his anxiety began to rise, Sunset would shift position slightly or make one of her calming sounds, and Thunder would settle again. "These lacerations are severe," Dr. Rodriguez reported as she cleaned the wounds with antiseptic. "The largest one is about 8 inches long and goes deep into the muscle tissue. There's also significant trauma to the left shoulder joint though. I don't think anything's broken." Thunder flinched as the antiseptic stung, a rumble of discomfort escaping his chest. Sunset immediately responded, lowering her head until her muzzle was just inches from Thunder's face. She breathed gently in his direction, and the bull's tension visibly decreased. "Incredible," Dr. Rodriguez muttered as she began suturing the worst of the cuts. "His pain response is completely manageable. Normally, an injury this extensive would require heavy sedation, but his stress levels are so low that he's tolerating the procedure beautifully." Sarah found herself crying as she watched the old Mare continue her patient vigil. Sunset never moved from her position, never broke the visual connection she'd established with Thunder. Despite the arthritis that should have made lying on the cold concrete agonizing, despite her own discomfort and fatigue, the horse maintained her calming presence throughout the entire medical procedure. "How is she doing this?" Jake whispered, his voice filled with awe. "It's like she's taking on his pain somehow, absorbing it so he doesn't have to carry it alone." Dr. Rodriguez worked steadily, cleaning and suturing wounds, administering antibiotics and pain medication, checking for internal injuries that might have been missed in the initial assessment. Through it all, Thunder remained cooperative in a way that defied every veterinary textbook she'd ever studied. The psychological component of animal trauma is something we're just beginning to understand, Dr. Rodriguez explained as she worked. But what I'm seeing here suggests that emotional support can be as important as medical intervention. Sunset isn't just keeping Thunder calm, she's actively participating in his healing process. As the veterinarian finished her work, applying bandages and protective coverings to the worst wounds, Thunder began to show signs of the sedative she'd administered. His massive head grew heavy, his breathing deepened, and slowly his eyes began to close. But even as consciousness faded, his gaze remained fixed on Sunset until the very last moment. "He's going to be fine," Dr. Rodriguez announced, sitting back on her heels with visible relief. "The wounds will heal cleanly, and there's no sign of internal bleeding or organ damage. With proper care and rest, he should make a complete recovery." Sarah felt her knees nearly buckle with relief, but her attention remained fixed on Sunset. The old Mare had finally begun to show signs of her age and condition. Moving carefully, she shifted position to ease the pressure on her arthritic joints, but she didn't move away from Thunder. Even unconscious, the bull seemed to draw comfort from her presence. "What about Sunset?" Sarah asked, her voice catching. "How long can she maintain this?" Dr. Rodriguez studied the old Mare with new respect. "As long as she chooses to, I suspect. Animals have a wisdom about these things that we often underestimate. She knows when Thunder no longer needs her." Maria knelt beside Sunset, gently stroking the Mare's neck. "You saved him," she whispered. "You saved them both." But as Sarah watched the old horse's patient vigil continue, she realized the salvation had flowed in both directions. Thunder's life had been preserved, but Sunset had rediscovered her purpose, proving that worth couldn't be measured in economics or physical capability, but in the depth of wisdom and compassion that comes from a lifetime of service and understanding. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood at the fence watching the most unlikely friendship she'd ever witnessed. Thunder, his wounds, now healed to angry pink scars that would fade with time, stood quietly beside Sunset in the winter pasture. The massive bull, who had once commanded attention through pure physical dominance, now seemed content to share space with the old Mare who had saved his life. The transformation extended far beyond Thunder's physical recovery. The bull, who had been invincible before his accident, had emerged from the crisis with a gentleness that ran deeper than his previous docility. He moved with careful awareness of others around him, as if Sunset had taught him that true strength lay in protecting, rather than overwhelming. "I've canceled Sunset's appointment indefinitely," Sarah announced to Dr. Rodriguez, who had arrived for Thunder's final follow-up examination. "She's got a new job now, animal therapist." It hadn't taken long for word of Sunset's remarkable abilities to spread through the local ranching community. In the past 3 weeks, she'd been called upon to help calm a traumatized Mare who'd survived a barn fire, assist with a young stallion separation anxiety, and even provide comfort to a dog recovering from surgery. Each intervention had been successful, though none as dramatic as her work with Thunder. Dr. Rodriguez had begun documenting the ranch's approach, collaborating with animal behaviorists to understand the mechanisms behind what they were calling therapeutic animal intervention. The preliminary findings suggested that animals who had experienced their own trauma and recovery could serve as emotional bridges for others facing similar crises. Jake, who had initially been the most skeptical, now sought Sunset's presence whenever dealing with difficult animals. "That old horse has taught me more about reading animal psychology in 3 weeks than I learned in 30 years, he admitted. Maria had been promoted to head of Animal Behavioral Services, a position created specifically to develop and implement Sunset's methods with other animals on the ranch. As Sarah walked through the barn on a clear morning, she paused at the stall that had once been scheduled for emptying. Sunset stood quietly, her arthritis visible but no longer defining her. The Mare's eyes held the same intelligence they always had, but now there was recognition of her value reflected in how others saw her. Thunder's recovery had saved the ranch financially, but Sunset's transformation had saved something more precious: Sarah's faith in Charlie's philosophy that every creature had purpose beyond economic calculation. The old Mare nickered softly as Sarah approached, and for a moment, Sarah could swear she heard Charlie's voice on the wind. "Every animal teaches us something. Sometimes the lesson changes everything." The greatest lesson had come from a horse they'd almost lost to economics, proving that wisdom, compassion, and the courage to remain useful despite limitations could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities built around care.